Well, welcome to another episode of the Addy Hour. It's my pleasure to be able to host these conversations and to really continue to talk about topics that I think are central and important for us as a society. And so today, I'm again honored to be able to welcome two guests from different walks of life who are going to be able to share their unique experiences, but also share some parallels and overlapping themes as well. The topic for today's conversation will be, where do we go from here? And I think in a lot of ways, this is a highly relevant topic and conversation. I mean, to be completely honest, it seems like we're just going from one tragic event to the next on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis. And so I think it's really important for us to be able to sit back and process how we actually move through that. So I'm honored to be able to host today's two guests. The first is Dr. Amy Arnsten. And Amy Arnsten is the Albert E. Kent Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Yale. She directs a research lab where she looks at and researches the processes and circuits in the brain that are affected by stress and by aging, and how those can lead to cognitive deficits. She's made a whole host of different seminal research contributions to the field over the years. She's also a member of the prestigious National Academy of Medicine. And so we're thrilled to have Amy here with us. One thing I will say, one of the things I really appreciate, in addition to all the accolades, is how Amy leads with passion. This is something you can see in the classroom when she's teaching, in the research lab, and in how she engages in society. So Amy, welcome to the Addy Hour. Definitely grateful to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Nate. A joy to be here.
Our second guest is none other than Lecrae. Lecrae is a multi-Grammy award-winning platinum-selling artist who has evolved into a New York Times bestselling author, entrepreneur, speaker, thought leader, and philanthropist, all while co-owning and serving as president of Reach Records. So he's someone who's had a lot of impact in a lot of different spheres. He's also sold millions of copies of his music worldwide, has won multiple Grammy Awards, Dove Awards, a Soul Train Music Award, and also had a BET Hip Hop nomination. But again, in addition to all the accolades, one thing I really appreciate about him is how invested he is in community and how he has continued to make those investments in several different ways. One of those more recent has been all the initiatives that he's taken part in and really trying to rebuild the west side of Metro Atlanta, in addition to other things that he's done in the Atlanta area and worldwide. So really grateful to have Lecrae here on the program with us today as well. Thanks for being here.
Honored, sincerely.
So we're ready to jump into this conversation and excited to really think deeply about this aspect of where do we try and go from here. For any of you who are regular listeners, you know, one of the things I like to do is really to check in with our guests first, just to see how you're doing in the midst of everything that's going on. Clearly, this has been another tragic week for us as a society, with ongoing killings of Black men and boys at the hands of police. And it's heavy. I mean, that's an honestly heavy place to be. I mean, I can say personally, a lot of times I move through a lot of different emotions when those things come up. There's a feeling sometimes of personal fear, just being completely honest. There's feelings of frustration, anger. There's feelings of exhaustion and tiredness. And sometimes I know I even shift towards being a little bit numb to just seeing this kind of happening over and over again. And then at the same time, I know that I have a deep need and desire for healing and hope. So it's really a mixture of things, and it kind of moves depending on the day and where I'm at any specific point in time. But I thought it would be really good for all of us, the three of us here, and for our listeners to really at least start out talking through how you're dealing with everything that's going on in society and even in your personal lives. So Amy, if we could go ahead and start with you, if you'd be willing to share.
Sure. And I also feeling weary from such a continued stress. Much of the past year for me personally, I was so worried about my mother, who's 99, which is wonderful. But she was in an assisted living facility, and it was a real race between the virus and the vaccine. And thank God she got the vaccine. And it was the same thing, with the election, where it was just this overwhelming anxiety. And thankfully, Biden won. But at this point when, I have this very childish feeling of, can't it all be all better now? And instead dealing now with the real problems that are still very much there. So, for example, my mother has gone blind and how to help her. And then at a national level, today, as we talk, just the national anxiety about what's going to happen in the Chauvin trial, you know? And I think over the past 4 years, so much got exposed about the many weaknesses in America that we had so hoped had really been solved a lot more than it has. And this realization, we have a long way to go. And that's going to take a lot of help. We have to really take care of ourselves and each other if we're going to make progress. And to relate to today's conversation, I find for myself that understanding how the brain responds to stress has really helped me have compassion for myself when I'm feeling inadequate and not living up to what I hope to be. And I think it's wonderful to have this opportunity to share this here today, because I think compassion and forgiveness, whether they come from science or religion or art, helps us to heal and can give us that strength we need.
That's so well said. Thank you for sharing so honestly about even the personal challenges and what the places that you find hope and healing in the midst of this as well. Lecrae, what about you? How are you managing at this current moment?
Well, it's interesting. I think, 2016 is when I really, 2014 through 16 is when I really found myself hyper-focused on a lot of the racial tensions and political tensions in America. And I did not consider how it would personally affect me. I think I just went in blind and not recognizing and real. I didn't understand the science of stress or anxiety or depression, any of those things. And I just, stuffed all of those emotions and feelings deep down inside, which ultimately resulted in a mental breakdown. And I think from 2018 until now, I'm so much more aware of, what hyper focusing on all of those particular things can do to me. And so I think in this season of life, I'm working to process solutions. I'm working to process how we can navigate and positive things that we can do in light of it all, because I think you can become a nihilist in a lot of ways if you just look at how crazy everything is. So for me, I've been trying to be helpful in as many ways as possible. I've been trying to figure out how do we invest in potential Dante Wrights, invest in the younger generation of George Floyd's, to create awareness and insight so that they can find themselves in a healthier place in life. And then at the same time, thinking through, what it looks like to communicate empathy to law enforcement and people on the other side of the aisle. And so all that to say, to get super scientific for some people, I am believing in neuroplasticity. I am trying to focus on new things so that changes can happen and healing can occur in my mind.
Well said. Well, I was joking before we got on that we were going to flip the roles a little bit, have Lecrae expand on the neuroscience and have Amy talk about her experiences with music. And there's room for that. But I appreciate you sharing, a little bit of the journey as well. And both of what you've shared, both from, personal experiences and what you've tried to do. Lecrae, I'd be curious to hear you expand on that even a little bit more on because you talked about how you've gotten to this place. What have you seen be effective in your journey? And on the flip side, things that you would also say that have been ineffective that you would have avoided or that you would do differently going forward?
Yeah, I think one is understanding your limitations. There are certain things that you can know about, but you may not need to see. And I think in the age we're in, I'm grateful for the accountability of video, but it doesn't mean I need to watch all the videos. Doesn't mean that's healthy for me to see people being murdered via video. And so part of it for me is not inundating myself with that, with those visuals. Figuring out, okay, what am I doing? What kinds of things can I do that make me feel like I'm investing and I'm working toward change? I think that's been helpful for me. And then more or less is, in light of everything going on societally, is I've had to find myself, where does my hope lie? And what am I grateful for? And how can I meditate on those particular things more often? The things that I wish I would have done different is I think that I found myself very hyper-focused on all of the negativity, and I did not look historically at the change that had occurred and that what it may take to see more change occur. I just looked at, the kind of the pessimistic side of everything. And I just found myself very low and it was a dark time. And if I could go back, I think I would have learned that hyper-focusing on all that was not healthy for me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's something we'll probably come back to in this conversation too, even thinking about how we get into that hyper-focused state and what's happening in our brain that allows that to occur and ways to even manage that. I think it's also great that you brought up the idea of hope and healing as well. And Amy, you were hinting at that and mentioning that when you talked about your perspective with neuroscience as well. So I'd be curious if you could share for our listeners how you got into this journey, or your journey to get to this place of thinking about the neuroscience of stress and resilience, and then also how that helps you even more so with the hope that you were talking about.
Sure. I actually began wondering about neuroscience and stress when I was a teenager. We had a lot of illness and death in my family with loved ones when I was that age. And I'd watch as like my parents, people around me who you were relying on as a kid, and suddenly they're this swirl. There's a quicksand there. You can't rely on them anymore because they weren't thinking straight. And I actually began volunteering at the state psychiatric hospital in New Jersey to learn more about mental illness. And it shows how old I am, that this was a time when there were these huge hospitals, 2,000 patients. And you can argue whether that was better than having people out on the street homeless. But volunteering there, I got to know several patients quite well. And one gentleman had schizophrenia and had been an astrophysicist. And we were able to talk about astronomy in this great way, totally logical. You'd never know he was ill. And then one day while we're doing that, someone mentioned the name of this really cruel doctor. And just hearing that man's name, this gentleman just instantly dissolved into what's called word salad, thought disorder, one clanging phrase after another that really didn't make sense. And then as he calmed down, his thoughts recongealed, and we continued our talk about the solar system. And it was like this explosive seed crystal to me of, this shows I have to understand what stress does to the brain, because it's such a clue as to what's underlying so many disorders, including schizophrenia. And so I've really studied it ever since. And thankfully, we've been able to make a lot of progress. And what we've learned, we meaning the field as well as me, that when you have a stress that makes you feel out of control, that's a key part of it. If you feel up to it, these toxic changes don't happen. But if you feel threatened or out of control, you get this flood of chemicals that takes what's called the prefrontal cortex offline. And the prefrontal cortex is one of our most newly evolved parts of our brain that subserves abstract reasoning, top-down control. So you really need it when you're going through a complex stressor in particular. And at the same time, this flood of stress chemicals strengthens our primitive circuits that make us unconsciously react, our emotional reactions and habits. So it's this double whammy where you're losing your rational cheerleader and at the same time strengthening these primitive reactions. And your brain can really get in a rut where it develops a vicious cycle and gets stuck there. And so a large part of what my lab is trying to do is understand what is it that makes prefrontal cortex weak versus stronger, so we can develop medication. So if you're in a rut, you can get some help getting to a healthier place. So it's been a long journey because I'm an old woman, but I can really trace it back to those childhood experiences.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I mean, to know that initial experience had such a long-term impact on you and your trajectory and your passion. I think that says a lot. And the fact that it sounds like, and you're motivated by the people that you're serving in a lot of ways as well.
Yes. Yeah, very much. And sometimes that person's me. Yeah.
So what I'd be curious to hear even more about that. How does that part come into play? The person being you, because I know it's a tension, and sometimes there are ways that different of us as scientists kind of reconcile that in different ways. So it'd be great to hear, how you've done that over the years.
Well, some of it is when I find myself losing it. Lecrae was saying, finding your limits. And I've also really come to say, okay, I can feel that my brain is not going into a good place. Stop watching the news for hours on end. Let's go for a walk in the woods. Knowing what your own limits are and what makes you feel better, which is individual for everybody, but learning that, and so you can take care of yourself better. And I'm also taking one of the medications my lab discovered, but that's because I'm an old lady. I'm not just a stressed person.
Yeah. Well, I think that's powerful in a lot of ways. And I appreciate your honesty in sharing that as well.
Who can say that? Who can say I'm taking a medication my lab discovered? That's just like, I have no comprehension of this. It's amazing.
That's a good point.
Well, we don't know if it's working though.
Okay.
We can ask those around you. I have a feeling they would say it's working. Look, Ray, how do you, you react to it, but how do you react to even the components that Amy's talking about in terms of how the brain's working? Like, hearing that now and thinking backwards to what you've already talked about, does that give you even a way to interpret some of the things that you were saying?
Yeah. It's just, I'm fascinated. I think like organizing chaos is something that's very fascinating for me, and I think the idea that I walk through life and, all the chaos that just ensues, and I didn't have categories for what was happening. I didn't have language for it. Like, oh, this is stress I'm feeling. You know what I mean? I don't think I had a context for it. And then even to go steps deeper and talk about, well, my prefrontal cortex isn't working properly. And, all those things are very helpful. Some things are just obvious to us. I'm grateful for the kind of playing field being leveled as it pertains to mental health, more so because I don't think people think it's as scientific as it is. I think they find themselves connecting their brain to their essence, like your identity in a lot of ways. And your biology is not the full extent of your identity. Sometimes it's kind of like right now, people don't know, I'm wearing contact lenses, but my identity is not that I don't think of like, oh my gosh, I need contacts, so I'm a terrible person. You know what I mean? I don't think like that. I think, how can I fix this blindness that I suffer from? You know, do I wear some glasses? Do I put in some contacts? And then I can move forward. But it's not like a crushing weight on my worth and my value, but oftentimes in my brain not functioning as it should, like a disorder, you tend to say, I'm terrible. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't know, like I have ADD. I don't know if it's ADHD, but it's definitely ADD. And I didn't know that as a kid. I just thought I was this impulsive, mischievous, irrational person. And now as an adult, it's like, oh, I wish I would have known that. And so I think it's very insightful and it's comforting to hear, you know, Amy talk about these things. It gives me comfort.
Yeah, that's really well said.
I'm so glad, because it does that for me too.
Yeah. I think that's a place that we all need to be in a lot of ways. I mean, even the point that you brought up about leveling the playing field, because not to be too pejorative to us as academics, but we have this tendency to get stuck in our bubble. We don't talk to anybody about the science outside of that bubble, and then we don't even interpret it for our own selves. So, I mean, Amy, I think everything you're talking about, I mean, I see that as unique in a lot of ways, as reflective as you've been about your work and your own emotions as you're walking through that, and being able to, I mean, the fancy word people use is metacognition, to be able to think about your thinking and what you're going through while it's happening. And to be able to have those tools, I think it makes it even that much more powerful to talk about your experience, so that those outside of the scientific realm can learn from it and actually apply it and see that we're applying it in our own lives as well. I mean, I think that's huge.
Well, and just a reminder that often you can't do that in the moment, because stress is taking exactly those circuits offline. But then not being mad at yourself about that and going back and revisiting and having that.
Yeah. So true.
I don't think people sit back and tell themselves like, oh man, my prefrontal cortex is short circuiting right now. Like, it's just good.
I do.
So on that note, that's actually a great segue, because I'm curious, we started this out thinking about where do we go from here? How do we take all these principles that you all are talking about and apply them right now in our current situation? Maybe not in the moment as we're seeing another unjust killing occurring, but in this moment as we're conversing and thinking about how are we going to deal with that if and when it happens again. Amy, any thoughts you want to jump in with to start off?
I want to go back to what we just said to add one more thought, that I think it's helpful to think of mental health as a continuous spectrum, that there's this continuum between health and illness, and also that a strength in one context can be a weakness in another. Including with ADD, there's times when having that kind of energy and being distracted by something that's just occurred can be life-saving for a person or a community who's with that person. So I think that helps reduce stigma and gives us, it's both more realistic, but also more compassionate view about brain health. And the recognition that if you've had either genetic insults, a physical insult, an emotional or physical trauma, that those are times when you need extra self-care. Recognizing limits that can shift and one can be more fragile, as Lecrae was talking about. So really taking care of our minds, brains, the way many people take care of their bodies with working out. And I think some people are already trying to do that with like drinking caffeine, but doing it in a much broader way with all the needs, and that can help give us a more effective view on mental health. for what you were just saying, this idea of how do we help ourselves feel more in control and give ourselves what we need to be able to help ourselves be our better self again. And it's so individual. So it's, again, you have to really know who you are. What are your triggers? What are the things that help to make you feel better? And important that they're the things that don't make you feel worse in the morning. So alcohol, drugs can make you temporarily feel better, but then you're worse. What are the things that give you sustained goodness? Even if it isn't so dramatic instantly, it's really there for you for the long run. And I think there's many things. For some people, it's things like meditation and exercise. Oh, and that reminds me, I got a call once from Arianna Huffington, who was writing a piece on the civil rights leaders of the 20th century and how they had to do self-care to get themselves through the long haul, and how, like, Rosa Parks did yoga. And so they really recognized something right from the start. This is going to be a very, very long and hard mission. We have to take care of ourselves. And I think we have forgotten that and are having to rediscover it. And so the kinds of things that can help people, feeling gratitude, gaining perspective from that, from walking through the woods is one of the things I like to do, through community, through artistic expression, and music in particular, I think can be particularly effective because music is so much about emotion, both expressing it and receiving it by listening to it. And my son is also a musician, so I get to watch this close up. And I get to see the comments on his YouTube videos, just like with Lecrae's, where people are saying, I have just lost this loved one, and your music has made all the difference to me, giving me hope again. Someone who was suicidal and listening to the music gave them what they needed to keep going on. So I think blessings rhyming with stressings is really important, Lecrae. So thank you for that.
Well said. I didn't know you were going to bring out some lyricism. I'm impressed. Very impressed.
Bravo. That's great. I would wholeheartedly agree with so much of what she said. I think, I look at my own life in light of everything. I experienced a lot of historic trauma. I was abused. I experienced neglect. I'm the men I looked up to, I was oftentimes visiting them in prison. So I didn't realize those are all contributing factors to my development and my mental health. And so I look at it like, the average person, if you think about their stress level as like a paper towel, if you got a paper towel on top of a cup or something like that, and you put some rice on top of that paper towel, it's going to sink down. But if there's like a rubber band around it, it'll sustain, it'll hold the rice. Well, I look at my historical trauma as like drips of water on my paper towel, and so when someone puts the rice on it, I'm more vulnerable. I'm more vulnerable to having a breakdown, to having that stress snap. And I think that's what's currently been helpful for me. I didn't know this in 2014 through 2016. I didn't know that. So I'm engaging these stressful circumstances, not realizing that I'm dealing with a wet paper towel. And now it's like, I know, I have a sensitive brain, right? Like my brain is sensitive It's hypersensitive. You know, I get false alarms in terms of anxiety all the time. And so I have to, in knowing that, I can think more rationally. And I probably have to spend more time, like she was just talking about Rosa Parks doing yoga. I spend more time meditating on truth. I think if you know, they say that people who know counterfeit money, they don't study counterfeit money. They study real money so well that when they see counterfeit, they can pick it out immediately. And that's kind of what I find myself having to do. I have to spend time meditating on what is true and what is good and not irrational things, so that when this false alarm gets triggered in my brain, I can say, that's not what this is. That's not what's happening right now. And so, you know, someone gets murdered on national television, I think it's stressful to anyone, right? But for me, I can, without having meditated on what's true, I can get very irrational and think, this is the end. You know, it's going to happen for me. This is, I don't know, my kids are, you know, and I can just start spinning out of control irrationally, which makes like chaos happen. And so I have to meditate and say, hey, listen, you know, what's true about this? Okay. Can you absolutely prove that someone's going to kick in your door tonight and kill your kids? No, I can't. So let's not go there. You know what I mean? Let's not get too wound up in that particular place. And I found that that's been very helpful for me, is really meditating on what I know is true to fight back that hypersensitivity going on in my brain.
Yeah, that's so good. And that ties in, it makes me think of one of the points that you made earlier too. You know, not to get too far outside the scope, but you talked about both sides of the aisle, you know, for us as Black men in this country, but then also for those who are in law enforcement. Because, you know, I have friends who are police officers. And if you have listened to some of the commentary, you know, with what happened to the individual that was in the armed services that got pulled over, people have been talking about the mental state or the hypervigilant state that the police were in when they pulled that person over, what was going through their minds at that moment. And we also, you know, have to talk about those situations too, and those individuals where they're coming into that situation from.
Yes.
So I know, I mean, being on the receiving end of that, you know, being pulled over, you know, I was coming back from a talk at Emory of all places, got back at 1 o'clock in the morning. On the way home, lived in a part of town that was kind of off the beaten path and got pulled over at 1 o'clock in the morning for no reason. So, you know, everything that's running through my mind, I was definitely in a hypervigilant state. But then also thinking about the Caucasian female officer that was walking up to my car, what was in her mind. So, I mean, just everything you've mentioned, I don't think we have those conversations enough. I don't know as much about the law enforcement side, but I feel like it's something that has to be had on both sides of the aisle. And that's definitely a live conversation in a lot of ways. So again, you know, that could be a whole nother topic of discussion, but I think sometimes we don't talk about what's happening in the brains on both sides and how once you put that together. Amy, I don't know if there's anything you want to add from your perspective about those stressors that come on both sides of the aisle in that way. But
oh yeah, no, and how empathy is our way out. Absolutely. No, you can really understand that when everybody's stressed, the worst things can happen. And forgiveness all around, if you possibly can, how hard that is. And then why de-escalation can be so helpful, and that there are programs and people out there who are actively trying to provide de-escalation, some of it based on neurobiology, to help people whose work constantly puts them in these threatening situations.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Yeah, and clearly it doesn't justify anything that's happened, but I think it's a part of the conversation that we need to really seriously talk about.
Well, yeah, it's the constructive way forward.
Exactly. And you know, one idea that's been lofted out there is that maybe you don't have law enforcement respond to every emergency that comes up, right? If they're trained to respond to violent criminal activity, maybe they don't need to be called for, you know, something that doesn't fall under that scale, because you're already hyper vigilant, as you said. So you're not thinking to de-escalate. You're in your fight or flight mode, and it's just a speeding ticket. You know what I mean? And you're in fight or flight mode. So it's, maybe there's some restructuring around all of that. I have a friend as well, who's a police officer, and he told me a story of him. You know, he's a black man, but he's chasing down someone who has committed a violent crime, and it's like a domestic abuse, if I'm not mistaken. And he catches him, and the guy starts fighting him violently. He's on drugs, and you know, he was in a situation where he was like, man, this guy is really dangerous, and he had to make a decision in that moment, like, as this guy broke through a hold and took off running, was it worth chasing after him and getting into an even more violent circumstance or situation? And he had to process that. But the crazy part about it was, you know, after that call, his emotions and everything is heightened. And then he's got to respond to another call that's nowhere near the same type of circumstances. And how does he turn his brain down, dial it down to deal with what's in front of him when he's just left a brawl, you know, with a violent individual? And so those are all the circumstances that I don't think we're talking about and we're processing.
Yeah, that's so true. And Amy, all the tools you've been talking about and the processes in the brain that we need to be aware of, it seems like they're all coming into play and would need to be an essential part of those conversations.
Yeah. And are there things like people who are specialized in dealing with mental health emergencies who could be in that car and there to help them, you know, have pharmacological tools to deal with somebody who's really psychotic, so that things with physical force don't need to be used as much. Much more thoughtful ways of how to proceed and protect the police as well as the other people.
This is so important. I mean, to be honest, I think that's something we'll probably have a more full extended conversation on this podcast at some point, because I think it's one that it's happening in small pockets, but it really needs to be a much larger and bigger conversation in a lot of ways. So I was curious, just, you know, as we talked about, you both have music ties, but how do you see music tying into this as well? Amy, you talked about the emotion. How does the music tie in, both in terms of like how we experience things and in terms of the brain? Like what is the power that's there? I'm putting you on the spot.
I'll be very speculative. So in right-handed individuals, the left hemisphere is usually what creates and understands language, whereas the right hemisphere creates and understands emotion in language. And to me, music is the right hemisphere without necessarily the words. And then, of course, we add words in songs, but you don't even need those to feel the emotion of songs. So that's something I just wondered about. Thinking about music as emotional expression that doesn't even need words.
That's well said.
I would not have been able to say it like that. That's great. I'm in my understanding and in the learning that I've had. One of the realizations that I've had is that I've been writing songs since I was a little kid, and probably, you know, around 2000, and I want to say the iPhone in terms of like writing and taking notes and computers and whatnot, I think that was more revolutionary for me anyway, around 2011 and 2010 maybe. And so I wonder, this is just me being speculative as well, but I wonder if all those years that I spent time actually using the motor skills to write and to process was helpful for my mental stability. And as I began to switch over and use the keyboard and use my phone to write, was I not getting all the same benefits? There was something therapeutic about writing down those lyrics. And also, in light of what Amy just said, I love creative expression. I think it's very helpful for me. I think, it connects with people. Music does. Minor chords hit a certain type part of the mind and the brain. Major chords get you more excited. But when I have to actually take the creative musical expression and then add concepts and words, it becomes a little tougher. It becomes a little more like of a push uphill. So I'm wondering if there's something to that, and you might have nailed something there. I know I need to have words because it connects with people, but it's just very interesting that I can get a kick out of just playing on the keys or, hearing a jazz, a saxophone solo, and it still gives me that same emotion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
And it's especially an uphill push if you have to make those words rhyme.
Tell me about it. Tell me about it. Yeah, I'm working on it.
Well, there's definitely something there. I mean, I'm just thinking back, not to disclose too many Addy secrets to my own songwriting days, and just the nostalgia that comes with it sometimes too. Like if I hear something I wrote 25 years ago, the place that it takes me back to. Granted, that's not, just all the positive triggering in a sense, in some ways. That's outside of my realm of expertise, but you all are making me.
Now we need to hear this music. I didn't even know you did music. So
I knew that was dangerous.
Don't worry, I won't let you forget about it.
I'm sure we'll bring it out. We'll bring it out in some shape or form.
So, I also wrote songs when I was a teenager.
Wow.
So the two of us should put out an album together.
Wow.
Oh, okay. Let me find out. It's got to happen now. We need that. Who knows when two neuroscientists get together, what kind of songs we're going to be created? We need that.
Well, you got to be pulled into this mix too.
All right, I'll see what I can do. I'll see if I have anything to contribute. The lyrics get a little too lofty for me, get a little too academic for me. I'll try to, be the person to make it make sense to the common person.
Well, I was ready for you to make a neuroscience comment when you were starting to follow Amy with that comment about the music and your writing. I was getting really excited about where you're going to take it.
Listen, I don't, I know the little bit that I do know, and I'm understanding the motor skills and the parts of the brain that are trying to work together and so on and so forth. And so, again, like I said, I'm all about trying to find as much healing as possible. And, I'm honored to be able to be in conversations like this because I'm always wondering, like, what are the new advances? What's going to happen? Look at what's happening. I drive a car that if I push a button, it can navigate itself through city streets. We got to figure something out with the brain. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. It's important. And on a serious note too, I think what you're doing by pulling in those pieces and communicating that to large audiences, that makes a difference too. Because I think that's part of what has to happen here. We need to have, and I think you were both referring to that earlier, we need to make sure that we communicate that it is the brain that is involved in these things and not lose sight of that, because that's where some of the stigma comes. That's where some of the fear comes and all the concerns about, if I broke my arm, I'm going to take care of that and get it put in a cast so I can heal. But if it's my brain, I don't want to touch that, or, just all of the reactions that come with that. So I think it's critical.
I think that's such an area for improvement, reducing stigma for mental health within medicine itself, let alone within society.
Yeah.
And also, of course, to make mental health resources so much more available and cheap.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
I think it's funny because to me, if I think about like a megaphone, a megaphone is small on one end and it's bigger on the other end. I feel like academia has the megaphone turned the opposite way. Like you got all this information and then it's like, it just gets kind of like, it's like, how do we get this out here to the general public? So I love this type of trying to figure out how to get it out to people.
There's so much there.
Yeah.
So, on purpose, I've been making YouTube videos and posting them on the Yale Medical School YouTube channel to provide this information to the public, to doctors who are not in the same field about burnout, for example, especially during COVID. So it is my own little way of trying to get that information out there. And I sent you one of the links that maybe you can put on the website.
Yeah, we can definitely put that up on the website. Great resource. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
So I know we're running tight on time, but I did want to ask both of you, what legacy are you trying to leave in terms of your passion? All the things that we've talked about. Like, how are you trying to make sure that that gets out and continues to make an impact to those around you? Amy, I'll have you, you started with the YouTube video, so I'll have you continue to expand on that.
Well, I'm really hoping that we continue to make progress in creating medications that really help us be our better selves, our better angels, so that when you feel stuck and lost, there's something you can turn to that's really healthy. I also wanted to say something I discovered in preparing for today's discussion. I was thinking a lot about the power of gratitude and forgiveness. And so I looked and said, I wonder if anybody has looked at what happens in the brain when you're feeling those emotions. And I found a few studies, including one by the Damasio Lab. And I was so struck that when you're feeling gratitude or forgiveness, it activates the same areas of prefrontal cortex that Rajita Sinha, who was your guest last time, has shown are the very circuits that help us overcome the stress response. So a real neural basis for how those feelings may really help us overcome the toxic effects of stress.
That's so good. That's so good. It goes back to what I think about what we're told in scripture a lot too, in terms of the importance of serving others. In some ways, it sounds to me like the neurobiological basis of what that is doing, and just kind of ties everything together. Wow.
That's great.
I felt so too, that it relates the song Blessings and religion and science all together by activating the ventromedial prefrontal cortex.
Wow. You tied that the way only you could tie that together.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And the day I see that in the lyric, Lecrae will be...
Yeah. Listen, I don't know I can't. That's interesting that she says that, because, my legacy, I definitely feel like my legacy is to figure out a way, to process the information that we currently have and to shrink the amygdala so that there's got to be a way to shrink the amygdala and to ignite the prefrontal cortex so that it can communicate clearly to the amygdala during stress circumstances. And I think if I can just, write a song that would allow that to happen, then the whole world has changed, clearly. That's my contribution and legacy.
I'm actually a little bit scared by your insight, because there are studies that maybe not strengthening amygdala, but they're looking at those exact pathways. So somehow you tapped into something.
Oh man. No, but sincerely, I see myself as a bridge. I live in a lot of different communities. Obviously the faith-based community, the African-American community, the musical community. And as someone who has struggled with mental illness, I've seen the benefit of the scientific community being able to speak to these places. And I want to be a bridge. I think that we've seen, and that's not the only legacy that I want to live, but specifically as it pertains to this, yes. We've seen, obviously within the Black community, just like the total, like, I don't know what therapy is. I don't do all that stuff. And just them understanding the necessity of a lot of these things. In the musical community, a lot of artists and musicians are brilliant and struggling with mental illness simultaneously. And they don't even realize that a lot of their their art is stemmed from depression or anxiety or, other types of disorders. And so just helping them understand that relationship so that they can find health. I don't think it's coincidental that, the musician community has the quote unquote 27 club where all these artists died at 27 years old, And so, and then obviously in the faith-based community, to erase a lot of the stigmas as well. I think there's this misconception that, the brain is not a physical entity, that it is all spiritual. And so to take medication is unspiritual, to seek therapy outside of a pastor or a priest or whatnot is somehow unbiblical. And so just to close those gaps would be very encouraging for me. Is something that I strive to be able to do. And so, yeah, I would love to see that happen. And I guess what I would say is this, is that I think that we're all in a band, and too many of us are playing solos, and we sound a lot better when we play together, when all this stuff is mixed together. And now there's information that is, widespread. And so you can embrace some of these cultural things, but then also add the scientific elements to it, and we're all healthier. So.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate to both of you for doing that in your own ways already, and for even coming on this podcast and doing that in this conversation, merging the science and the mental health and the faith and community. I think it's so important. So definitely appreciate the way you both contributed, and I'll be following the ongoing work that you all are doing.
Yeah,
Lecrae, you're the bridge that gives me hope.
Oh man.
Wow.
Well, I need you. I'm honored. And listen, I need you all to continue being brilliant, because otherwise I don't know what I'm doing out here.
Well, we're all working together for the same cause in a lot of ways. So definitely appreciate Dr. Amy Arnsten, Lecrae. Thanks so much for joining on the Addy Hour. It's been a pleasure. I know this is going to be enjoyable for folks to listen to as well. I think a lot of things that will equip people too. So
yeah, appreciate it. Honored, sincerely.